Marcos stood at the edge of the basketball court, watching the young athletes run their drills. His eyes followed every movement, scanning for mistakes and untapped potential. For him, this was more than just a job. It was a calling. The Turning Point Training Center had become his sanctuary, a place where he could use his experience and passion for basketball to help shape the next generation. At 32, Marcos was no stranger to the challenges these kids faced. His journey in the sport had been cut short by personal struggles and prejudice. He knew all too well what it felt like to be overlooked and underestimated. Now, as a trainer, he made it his mission to ensure that none of these kids would ever feel the same. He walked up and down the court, giving pointers, correcting stances, and offering words of encouragement. The athletes respected him, but there was always tension in the air, especially when Carlos was around. Carlos, a veteran coach in his 50s, had been with the center since its early days. He was known for his strict and often outdated methods. To him, discipline and tradition were paramount. He observed Marcos with a critical eye, seeing him as a challenge to his authority. Carlos stood at the far end of the court, his arms crossed, eyes narrowed. He didn't say much, but his presence was enough to make everyone feel on edge. He had always been skeptical of Marcos's approach. In Carlos's view, there was no room for emotions in training, no place for soft methods. To him, Marcos represented everything wrong with the new generation of coaches. Too empathetic, too willing to change the rules. Lucas, the athlete in ascension, was doing layup drills with the other players. He was quick and precise, but there was a noticeable tension in his movements. Lucas admired Marcos quietly. He knew firsthand how Marcos's coaching could transform lives. Lucas had his own story, a story that most people at the center didn't know. When he looked at Marcos, he didn't just see a coach, he saw a mentor and a savior. As the drills ended, Marcos gathered the players around him. "Great work today, everyone," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Remember, it's not just about speed or strength, it's about control and focus. Keep working on that." Carlos approached slowly, his expression unreadable. "Not bad," he said, his tone icy, "but I think they're spending too much time on these mindset exercises. They need to push harder, physically. This is basketball, not therapy." Marcos felt the familiar sting of Carlos's criticism, but tried to keep his composure. "They need both," he replied. "Physical strength is nothing without mental resilience." Carlos gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "Resilience comes from hard work, not from talking about feelings." He turned to the players. "Get ready for a real workout tomorrow," he barked. "No more of this touchy-feely nonsense." The players exchanged uneasy glances. Lucas clenched his jaw but remained silent, his respect for Marcos making him hold back his growing anger toward Carlos. Marcos watched Carlos walk away, his fists tightening at his sides. It was clear that Carlos saw him as a threat, and this tension was only the beginning. As the players dispersed, Lucas approached Marcos. "Coach, don't let him get to you," Lucas said quietly. "We all know who's really helping us improve." Marcos gave a small, grateful nod. "Thanks, Lucas," he replied. "It's just, he's been here for so long, and it's hard to change how people think." Lucas placed a hand on Marcos's shoulder. "You changed the way I think," he said, "and I'm not the only one." Those words stayed with Marcos as he headed to his office later. He looked at the old trophies and faded photographs lining the walls, remnants of his own past in the sport. They reminded him of a time when he too had big dreams. But those dreams were crushed, not just by his own personal battles, but by the very same attitudes that Carlos embodied. The idea that only a certain kind of strength mattered. Sitting at his desk, Marcos felt a mix of determination and doubt. He knew he was fighting more than just old-fashioned training methods. He was fighting a mindset, one that he himself had been a victim of. And now Carlos was trying to impose that same mindset on these kids. The door creaked open, and Marcos looked up to see Carlos standing in the doorway, his face stern. "You think you're helping them," Carlos said, his voice low, "but you're just giving them false hope. Not everyone makes it, Marcos. You should know that better than anyone." Marcos stared at him, the words cutting deep. He had known failure. He had felt the sting of crushed dreams, but he had also learned something valuable. "Hope isn't false if it helps them fight," Marcos replied calmly. "That's what these kids need. A reason to fight, even if they don't make it to the top." Carlos shook his head and left without another word, leaving Marcos alone with his thoughts. The challenge ahead was clear, but Marcos knew he had to stand firm. Not just for himself, but for every kid on that court who was looking for something to believe in. The next day, the atmosphere in the training center was tense. The players could sense the unease between Marcos and Carlos, and it affected their focus. As promised, Carlos had taken over the session, and his drills were grueling. The players pushed through the exercises, their faces strained as they tried to keep up with his relentless pace. Marcos watched from the sidelines, his jaw tight, hands clenched at his sides. Carlos barked orders with a harsh tone. "Faster! You call that running? Move it!" He drove them through endless sprints and punishing circuits. Marcos felt his frustration build with every lap the kids ran. He knew they needed to be pushed, but Carlos was pushing them to the point of breaking. After an hour of intense drills, Carlos finally called for a break. The players collapsed on the benches, gasping for breath, their bodies drenched in sweat. Marcos walked over with water bottles, handing them out silently. He caught Lucas's eye. The young athlete looked exhausted, his forehead beaded with sweat. But there was a defiant glint in his eyes. "You're doing great," Marcos said quietly, handing him a bottle. Lucas nodded, taking a deep breath. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," he whispered. "He's going to run us into the ground." Marcos glanced over at Carlos, who was standing with his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the players like a drill sergeant assessing his troops. "He thinks this is the only way to make you stronger," Marcos replied. "But strength isn't just about physical endurance." Lucas looked at him, confusion mixed with fatigue on his face. "What do you mean?" Marcos leaned closer. "Strength is about knowing your limits and pushing them wisely. It's about resilience, not just in your muscles, but in your mind." Carlos only sees one side of that. Carlos suddenly turned towards them, his gaze sharp. "You have something to say, Marcos?" His voice cut through the gym like a blade. Marcos straightened up. "I was just telling them to stay hydrated," he replied evenly. Carlos snorted. "Hydration won't help them if they don't have the guts to push through pain." He walked over, his eyes locked on Marcos. "You coddle them too much. Out there, no one cares if they're tired or sore." Marcos took a step forward, feeling the tension between them spike. "Pushing them to their breaking point won't make them stronger. It'll just break them." Carlos's eyes narrowed. "You think you know better? These kids need to toughen up if they want to succeed." "There's a difference between toughening up and burning out," Marcos shot back, his voice rising. "They need to build resilience, not fear." The players watched the confrontation unfold, the air around them growing thicker with every word. For many of them, it was the first time they had seen someone stand up to Carlos. Lucas felt his heart pound in his chest, his gaze shifting between the two coaches. This was more than just a disagreement about training methods. This was a clash of philosophies, a battle over what kind of strength truly mattered. Carlos glared at Marcos, his jaw clenched. "Fine," he said after a moment, his voice cold. "You want to handle the next drill? Be my guest. Show them how your resilience works." Marcos hesitated, feeling the weight of the challenge. He knew this was a test, a chance for Carlos to undermine him in front of the entire team. But it was also an opportunity, a moment to show the players that strength came from more than just brute force. He nodded slowly. "All right, I'll take the next drill." Carlos stepped back, crossing his arms, a smug look on his face. "Let's see what you've got then." Marcos took a deep breath and turned to the players. Their eyes were on him, waiting to see what he would do. He knew he had to find a way to connect with them, to teach them the value of pushing through challenges in a way that would build them up, not tear them down. This was his moment to prove that his approach wasn't just talk. It was a different kind of strength. As Marcos prepared the next drill, Lucas felt his mind drifting back to the past. The tension between Carlos and Marcos had stirred memories he usually kept buried. There was a time when he had been on the brink of giving up on everything. Back then, basketball wasn't a passion or a sport. It was his only way out. Lucas grew up in a rough neighborhood where the odds were always against him. His father had left when he was young, and his mother worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads. Most of the kids he knew either got caught up in trouble or struggled to stay afloat. For Lucas, life felt like a series of closed doors, each one slamming shut just as he thought he might catch a break. He remembered the days when he wandered the streets aimlessly, feeling the pull of a world that offered little hope. Basketball courts in his neighborhood were usually empty, abandoned by those who couldn't afford the luxury of a dream. Lucas had learned to play on cracked pavement, using a torn net and a ball that barely held air. But those moments on the court were the only times he felt alive, the only times the weight of his reality lifted, even if just for a while. It was during one of those solitary sessions that Marcos first saw him. Lucas had been shooting hoops, his focus intense, as if the world outside the court didn't exist. Marcos had watched from a distance, observing the raw talent and determination in the young boy's movements. He saw something of himself in Lucas, the fire, the drive, and also the struggle. Marcos approached him slowly, making sure not to startle him. "You've got a good shot," he had said casually, leaning against the fence that surrounded the court. Lucas glanced over, wary. "Thanks," he muttered, continuing to dribble the ball. "Mind if I join?" Marcos asked. Lucas hesitated, not used to people offering to play with him. But something about Marcos's presence felt different, calm, non-threatening. "Sure," he replied, passing the ball to him. They played for a while, exchanging few words but many passes. Marcos didn't push him, didn't try to give him tips or advice. He just played, matching Lucas's intensity, letting the game speak for itself. It wasn't until they took a break that Marcos started a conversation. "What's your plan?" Marcos asked, sitting on the bench beside Lucas, who was gulping down water. Lucas shrugged. "Plan? I don't know. Survive, I guess." Marcos nodded, understanding the weight behind those words. He had been there once, living day by day, unsure of what the future held. "Basketball could be more than just a game for you," Marcos said. "It could be a way out." Lucas looked at him, skepticism in his eyes. "A way out? People like me don't get out. Not really. We just get by." Marcos leaned forward, his expression serious. "That's not true. You have talent, Lucas. But more than that, you have the drive. I can see it. And if you're willing to work for it, basketball can open doors you never thought possible." Lucas remembered feeling a flicker of hope in that moment, a feeling he had long buried. It was the first time someone had seen more in him than just another kid from the streets. Marcos didn't just offer him training, he offered him a vision of what his life could be. And so Lucas began to train under Marcos's guidance. It wasn't easy. Marcos pushed him hard, but he also knew when to pull back, to let Lucas find his own rhythm. He taught Lucas about the game, but more importantly, he taught him about resilience, discipline, and believing in something greater than his circumstances. Slowly, basketball became more than just a distraction. It became a purpose. It kept Lucas out of trouble, gave him a reason to wake up early, to stay late on the court, to push his limits. It became the beacon that guided him through the darkness of his reality. Back in the present, as he watched Marcos preparing the drill, Lucas felt a surge of emotion. He owed everything to this man, the man who saw potential where others saw a lost cause. The thought of Carlos dismissing Marcos's approach made his blood boil. Carlos didn't know what it meant to fight against the odds every single day. He didn't understand that for some people, basketball wasn't just a sport, it was salvation. Marcos signaled for the players to gather around, and Lucas snapped out of his reverie. As he jogged over to join the group, he made a silent vow. Marcos had given him a chance when no one else would. Now it was his turn to stand by Marcos, to fight for the kind of training and guidance that had saved his life. He knew that the next few days wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. For the first time, he felt like he had the power to make a difference, to repay the man who had given him hope. Marcos spent the rest of the day feeling the weight of the confrontation with Carlos. Despite the support from Lucas and the other athletes, the veteran coach's words had struck a nerve. After the practice ended and the players had left, Marcos remained on the court, staring at the faded lines on the floor. This was his dream, but it was starting to feel like a losing battle. He knew Carlos's type all too well. Those who believed that toughness was the only way to succeed. In their eyes, there was no room for empathy or understanding. It was a mindset that had pushed Marcos out of the game as a player, and now it seemed to be threatening his role as a coach. Carlos's dismissal of his methods brought back memories of his own struggles on the court, memories he had tried to bury. Marcos had once been a promising player, full of potential. He had fought to earn his spot, battling not just against opponents, but against the subtle and not so subtle prejudices of the sport. Coaches who looked at him and saw a stereotype rather than an athlete. They pushed him harder, demanded more. But when he faltered, they were quick to write him off. When personal challenges overwhelmed him, challenges he had no support to navigate, he was cast aside. Basketball, which had been his sanctuary, turned into a reminder of everything he couldn't overcome. It had taken him years to find his way back, to carve out a new purpose for himself in coaching. Now, standing on the same court where he had begun to rebuild his life, he felt the old doubts creeping back in. Was Carlos right? Was he just giving these kids false hope, setting them up for disappointment? Marcos knew what failure looked like. He had lived it, but he also knew what it felt like to fight with everything you had, even when the odds were against you. That was the lesson he wanted to pass on to these kids. But if he couldn't get Carlos to see that, how could he expect the players to truly believe it? As he sat down on the bleachers, he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Lucas standing there, his face serious. "Coach, you okay?" Lucas asked, concern in his voice. Marcos forced a smile. "Yeah, just thinking." Lucas sat down next to him. "Thinking or doubting?" he asked bluntly. Marcos let out a sigh, dropping the facade. "A bit of both, I guess," he admitted. "Carlos, he's not entirely wrong. I know not everyone makes it in this game. Maybe I'm giving you all false hope." Lucas shook his head firmly. "No, you're giving us a chance. There's a difference. You think any of us would be here if we didn't believe in that chance?" Marcos looked at him, the earnestness in Lucas's eyes stirring something inside him. "It's not just about belief," he said. "It's about the reality that you might not make it to the top, and I don't want to set you up for failure." "But you're not," Lucas insisted. "You're setting us up for something bigger than just winning games. You're teaching us how to fight for something, how to believe in ourselves when no one else does. That's not false hope. That's strength." Marcos felt a lump form in his throat. Hearing those words from Lucas reminded him why he had started coaching in the first place. It wasn't about creating champions on the court. It was about creating champions in life. People who could face adversity, who could pick themselves up after a fall. He had lost sight of that in his clash with Carlos. He had let the older coach's rigid mindset make him question his own purpose. "You know," Lucas continued, "when you took me under your wing, I didn't think I had a future in this game. But you showed me that it wasn't about where I ended up. It was about how I got there. You taught me that the fight is what makes us strong, not just the wins." Marcos nodded, feeling the resolve returning. Lucas was right. It wasn't the victories that defined them. It was the journey, the resilience they built along the way. Carlos's way might produce athletes, but Marcos wanted to produce people who knew how to overcome life's challenges, whether they were on the court or off. "Thanks, Lucas," Marcos said, his voice steadier now. "I needed that reminder." Lucas smiled. "Anytime, coach. Just remember, we're with you, all of us." As Lucas walked away, Marcos sat for a moment longer, absorbing their conversation. The doubt wasn't entirely gone. It would probably always be there, lingering in the corners of his mind. But now it felt less like a weight and more like a challenge. A challenge to prove that there was more than one way to be strong, more than one way to succeed. He wasn't just teaching these kids basketball, he was teaching them how to face the world. With renewed determination, Marcos stood up and looked around the empty gym. Tomorrow would bring another practice, another clash with Carlos, another chance to prove what he believed. And this time, he was ready. The next morning, the training center buzzed with the usual energy of athletes preparing for practice. Marcos entered the gym with a sense of resolve he hadn't felt in a long time. Lucas's words had reignited his purpose, and he knew today would be pivotal. Carlos was already there, barking orders and setting up drills with his usual intensity. Marcos watched him for a moment, then took a deep breath and stepped forward. Carlos glanced at him, eyes narrowing. "Ready for another round of your resilience training?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Marcos met his gaze steadily. "I'm ready to show these kids what real strength looks like." Carlos smirked. "Then let's see it." The players gathered around, sensing that today would be different. They had seen the tension building between the two coaches and knew that whatever happened today would set the tone for the future of their training. Marcos could feel their eyes on him, a mix of hope and apprehension. He knew he had to be careful with how he approached this. It wasn't just about proving Carlos wrong, it was about proving to the kids that there was value in what they were learning. All right, everyone, Marcos began, his voice strong and calm. Today we're going to do something different. We're going to focus on pushing past our limits, but not in the way you think. This isn't about running until you drop. It's about understanding when to push and when to listen to your body, to your mind. It's about building the kind of strength that lasts. Carlos crossed his arms, watching with a look of skepticism. Sounds like an excuse to go easy on them, he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. Marcos ignored the comment and continued. Lucas, step up, he called. Lucas came forward, his expression serious. We're going to run a drill, Marcos said, but it's not just about speed or endurance. It's about maintaining focus and control under pressure. Marcos explained the drill, which involved a combination of ball handling, footwork, and decision-making under time conditions. It was designed to test not just physical endurance, but mental agility and resilience. The players watched as Lucas started the drill, moving through the course with precision. It was challenging, and at moments Lucas faltered. But each time Marcos coached him through, emphasizing calm and focus rather than pushing him to exhaustion. Stay with it, Marcos encouraged. Breathe. Find your rhythm. Lucas found his pace, his movements becoming more fluid as he adapted to the challenges of the drill. The other players began to see what Marcos was teaching, the importance of staying mentally sharp even when your body is tired. It wasn't about pushing until you collapsed. It was about pushing until you mastered the challenge. Carlos watched, his face expressionless. When the drill ended, the players erupted in applause, not just for Lucas, but for what they had witnessed. It was a new way of understanding their limits, a way that made them feel empowered rather than drained. But the moment of triumph was short-lived. Carlos stepped forward, his expression dark. That's all well and good, he said, his voice cold. But in a real game, no one's going to care how focused you are if you can't keep up physically. If you don't have the guts to push through pain, you'll never make it. Marcos felt the air in the gym grow tense. This was it. The confrontation he had been trying to avoid but knew was inevitable. Physical endurance is important, Marcos agreed, his voice calm but firm. But it's not the only thing. Mental resilience is what keeps you in the game when your body wants to give up. It's what allows you to make smart decisions under pressure. Carlos's eyes flashed with anger. You think these kids can get by on your soft methods? Life isn't going to go easy on them. They need to be toughened up, not babied. Lucas couldn't stay silent any longer. He stepped forward, his voice shaking but resolute. Coach Carlos, he began, with all due respect, you're wrong. Gas rippled through the gym. No one had ever dared to confront Carlos like this. Carlos turned to Lucas, his expression one of shock and disbelief. Excuse me? Lucas took a deep breath, his heart pounding. I've been through tough times, harder than any drill you could throw at me, he said. And it wasn't the ability to endure pain that got me through it. It was what Coach Marcos taught me. How to keep my mind focused. How to believe in myself even when everything seemed against me. Carlos opened his mouth to retort, but Lucas continued, his voice gaining strength. I grew up where the only thing tougher than the streets was the people on them. I learned early on that just being physically tough wasn't enough. I needed to be mentally strong too. And that's what Coach Marcos has been teaching us. How to build a strength that goes beyond muscle and endurance. The gym fell silent. Marcos felt his heart swell with pride and gratitude. Lucas was saying everything he had been trying to convey, but hearing it come from one of the players made it resonate in a way that nothing else could. Carlos stood there, speechless for a moment. He looked around at the players, their eyes filled with a mixture of determination and newfound understanding. They weren't just athletes pushing through physical limits. They were individuals learning to navigate the mental challenges that life threw at them. Slowly, Carlos's shoulders sagged. The hard lines on his face softened, replaced by a look of reluctant realization. He turned to Marcos, his voice low. Maybe there's more to this than I wanted to see. Marcos nodded, his expression one of quiet acceptance. It's not about who's right or wrong, Carlos. It's about giving these kids the tools they need to face whatever comes their way, on or off the court. Carlos sighed and gave a short nod. Maybe it's time I learned something new too. Marcos extended his hand, and after a brief hesitation, Carlos shook it. The gym erupted in applause, not because a battle had been won, but because a new understanding had been reached. The players knew that they were a part of something bigger, a lesson in strength, resilience, and unity. The days following the confrontation were different. The tension that had once hung heavy in the air of the training center began to lift. Carlos was quieter, more reserved, as if he was wrestling with his thoughts. The players noticed the shift, and so did Marcos. They all knew that something fundamental had changed during that decisive confrontation. But what would come next was still uncertain. Carlos found himself spending more time observing the practices from a distance. He watched Marcos's approach with the players, the way he combined physical drills with mental exercises that challenged them to think, to adapt, to push past not just physical limits, but mental ones as well. For the first time, Carlos saw the value in what Marcos was doing. It wasn't just about making them physically stronger. It was about making them smarter, more resilient, and more prepared for the unpredictable nature of both the game and life. One afternoon after practice had ended and the gym had emptied, Carlos approached Marcos. He looked different, less rigid, his face etched with something that resembled humility. "Marcos," he began, his voice quieter than usual. "Can we talk?" Marcos nodded, motioning for him to sit on the bleachers. Carlos hesitated before sitting down, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Carlos admitted, his gaze fixed on the basketball court in front of them. "For a long time, I've believed that pushing hard was the only way to make these kids strong, that if they could endure the physical pain, they could endure anything." Marcos listened, sensing that this was a rare moment of vulnerability from the veteran coach. Carlos continued, his voice rough. "But I realize now that I was only seeing part of the picture. When Lucas spoke up, it was like a slap in the face. He made me see that toughness isn't just about physical endurance. It's about having the mental strength to face what's in front of you, even when it's terrifying." Marcos nodded slowly. "Physical strength is important, but without mental resilience, it can only take you so far. Life throws things at you that no amount of muscle can prepare you for." Carlos sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I guess I was so focused on making them tough that I forgot to make them resilient. I forgot that they need more than just physical training. They need to believe in themselves, to understand their own minds." There was a pause, a silence filled with the echoes of years of rigid beliefs and hard lessons. "You know," Carlos said, his voice softening, "when I was their age, all I knew was that I had to be tough. I came up through coaches who pushed me to my limits, who taught me that showing any sign of weakness was failure. I guess I just carried that forward, thinking it was the only way." Marcos looked at him, seeing for the first time not just a stubborn, outdated coach, but a man shaped by his own experiences. "We all carry our past into what we do," Marcos replied gently. "But sometimes, we need to let go of what held us back to see what can move us forward." Carlos nodded, his eyes reflecting the years of internal battles he had fought. "I want to do better by these kids," he said. "I want to learn from you. I know I can't change overnight, but I want to try." Marcos felt a sense of relief and a newfound respect for Carlos. It wasn't easy for someone like him to admit they were wrong, to open themselves up to change. "It takes strength to admit when we've been wrong," Marcos said. "The same kind of strength we've been trying to teach these kids." Carlos offered a small, almost uncertain smile. "So where do we start?" Marcos glanced at the court, then back at Carlos. "We start by working together. We combine what we both know and create a program that challenges them in every way. Not just physically, but mentally and emotionally too. We show them that true strength comes from all parts of who they are." Carlos nodded, and for the first time he looked at Marcos not as a threat, but as a partner. They sat in silence for a while, letting the new understanding settle between them. The gym, usually filled with the noise of bouncing balls and shouting, felt peaceful. The next day when practice began, the players noticed the difference immediately. Carlos still ran drills, but there was a change in his approach. He pushed them, but he also encouraged them to think, to strategize. He started integrating some of Marcos's mental resilience exercises into the routine. At first, the players were confused, unsure of what to make of this new version of Carlos. But as the days went on, they began to see the benefits. Lucas watched with a sense of pride and satisfaction. He saw Carlos and Marcos working together, blending their methods into something that made the training more holistic. It was no longer just about physical endurance or mental strength. It was about becoming well-rounded athletes who could face any challenge with confidence and composure. For Marcos, it was a validation of everything he had believed in. Seeing Carlos come around, seeing the players grow not just in skill, but in self-belief, made every struggle worth it. He knew they were building something important here, something that went beyond basketball. They were building a community of resilience and support. As practice ended that day, Marcos and Carlos stood together on the sidelines, watching the players gather their things. "Looks like we've got a solid team," Carlos said, his tone lighter than it had ever been. Marcos nodded, a satisfied smile on his face. "A team that's learning what it means to be truly strong." Carlos turned to him, a look of gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, Marcos, for not giving up on this, for not giving up on me." Marcos placed a hand on his shoulder. "We're all learning, Carlos, and that's the point. Growth never stops for any of us." They stood there for a moment, two coaches from different generations, now united in a shared mission. The journey ahead was still long, but now they were walking it together, leading the next generation with a strength that was both physical and mental, a strength that could change lives. With Carlos and Marcos working together, the atmosphere at the training center transformed. The players felt the change immediately. The once harsh and unyielding environment shifted into one of support and holistic growth. Carlos and Marcos began to integrate their approaches, creating a training program that pushed the athletes physically while also building their mental resilience. The new regimen was demanding, but it was different. Each drill had a purpose beyond just physical endurance. Marcos introduced exercises that challenged the players to think critically during high-pressure situations, teaching them how to maintain their focus when fatigue set in. Carlos, to everyone's surprise, embraced these new techniques. He added his own touch, turning them into competitive games that motivated the players to give their best effort. Lucas thrived in this environment. He had always been a strong player, but now he was developing a deeper understanding of the game. He learned not only to push his physical limits, but also to control his emotions, to keep his mind clear in the heat of the moment. He started helping other players, sharing the lessons he had learned from Marcos, and encouraging them to embrace the mental aspects of training. Marcos watched with a sense of pride as Lucas stepped into a leadership role. It was a sign of how far the young athlete had come. Lucas was no longer the kid who struggled to see a future beyond the streets. He was becoming a mentor in his own right, embodying the very principles that Marcos and Carlos were trying to instill in all their athletes. One day, as practice was wrapping up, Carlos called the team together. "Listen up, everyone," he began, his voice carrying authority, but now with a hint of warmth. "You've all been working hard, and we've seen some amazing progress. But this is just the beginning. Being a great athlete isn't just about what you can do on this court. It's about who you are when things get tough, both here and out there." Marcos stepped forward, picking up where Carlos left off. "We're not just training you to win games," he added. "We're training you to face challenges, to push through obstacles with everything you've got, whether it's on this court or in life. It's the strength you build inside that matters." The players listened intently. They could see the change in Carlos, the way he now spoke about resilience and mental fortitude, with the same conviction he once reserved only for physical toughness. They realized they were part of something bigger than just a basketball team. They were learning skills that would carry them far beyond the boundaries of the sport. As the weeks passed, the center became a hub of growth and transformation. More young athletes started to join, drawn by the reputation the center was building for not just developing great players, but strong individuals. Marcos and Carlos worked tirelessly, each bringing their own strengths to the table. They were different, but together they created a balance that made the training program unique and impactful. The local community began to take notice. Parents, once skeptical of the rigorous training, now saw the positive changes in their children. They saw them becoming more disciplined, more focused, and more confident. The center was no longer just a place where kids went to learn basketball. It was a place where they learned about life, about facing adversity, and about building character. One afternoon, after an intense practice session, Carlos approached Marcos as they watched the players cool down. "You know," Carlos said thoughtfully, "I used to think that coaching was about shaping athletes, but now I see it's about shaping people." Marcos smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment that words couldn't fully capture. "That's always been the goal," he replied. "The wins and losses on the court are temporary, but the lessons they learn here will stay with them forever." Carlos nodded, a look of contentment on his face. "I'm glad I finally understood that." Marcos looked at the players, who were now stretching and talking with each other, the camaraderie evident in their interactions. "They're more than just a team," he said. "They're a community." As they stood there watching the new generation of athletes grow, they knew they had built something special. The training center had become a place where young people came to discover their strength, to find a sense of purpose, and to learn that their value wasn't just measured by their athletic ability, but by their resilience and character. The transformation of the training center didn't go unnoticed. Word spread about how the Turning Point had become more than just a place for athletic development. It had become a symbol of hope and resilience. The local community rallied behind the center, recognizing it as a safe haven where young athletes could grow, not just in skill, but in character. Marcos and Carlos worked tirelessly, refining their training methods, organizing community events, and expanding their reach. They brought in guest speakers, former athletes, coaches, and even professionals from various fields, to share their stories of overcoming obstacles. Each story reinforced the idea that the lessons learned through basketball extended far beyond the court. Lucas continued to rise as a leader within the team. His journey from a troubled past to becoming a beacon of hope for his peers was nothing short of inspiring. He started mentoring the younger players, sharing his experiences and teaching them the values that had been instilled in him. It wasn't just about becoming a better athlete, it was about becoming a better person. One of the most anticipated events of the year was the annual community tournament, an opportunity for the training center's athletes to showcase their skills. But this year, it was more than just a competition. It was a chance for the community to witness the impact of the center's philosophy in action. Marcos and Carlos knew this tournament was the perfect stage to demonstrate how far their athletes had come. As the day of the tournament arrived, the gymnasium was packed with spectators, parents, friends, and community members eager to support the team. The air buzzed with excitement and anticipation. For many of the athletes, it was their first time playing in front of such a large crowd. Marcos could see the mix of nerves and excitement on their faces as they prepared for the game. "Remember," Marcos said, gathering the team in a huddle before the game, "this is just another court, the same game you play every day. Focus on what you've learned. It's not about the win or the loss. It's about how you face the challenge." Carlos stepped in, his voice carrying a calm confidence. "You've trained for this. You know what to do. Trust in yourselves, trust in each other, and give it everything you've got." The team nodded, their eyes shining with determination. As the game began, the players took to the court with a sense of purpose. They moved with precision and focus, executing plays with a level of discipline and mental fortitude that impressed even their opponents. It was clear that they weren't just playing with their bodies, they were playing with their minds. Throughout the game, the crowd witnessed moments that went beyond the scoreboard. When a player missed a crucial shot, they didn't hang their head. They hustled back on defense, ready for the next play. When fatigue set in, they tapped into the mental resilience they had built, pushing through not with reckless abandon, but with strategic effort. They communicated, supported each other, and showed a level of sportsmanship that earned the respect of everyone watching. In the final minutes, the game was close. The pressure was intense, but the team remained composed. They executed their plays with the same focus they had practiced, and in the end, they emerged victorious. The gym erupted in cheers, not just for the win, but for the spirit in which the game was played. As the team celebrated, Marcos and Carlos stood back, watching with pride. This was the culmination of everything they had worked for. They had turned a group of individuals into a team, not just in skill, but in character. After the game, the community gathered for a small ceremony. Marcos and Carlos were invited to speak. Carlos took the microphone first, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. "Today, we saw more than just a game. We saw what happens when you believe in yourselves and in each other. This team has shown that strength comes from within, and that is the legacy of the Turning Point." Marcos stepped forward, feeling a wave of gratitude. This center was built on the idea that sports can change lives. And what you've shown here today is proof of that. You've learned to face challenges head-on, to push through adversity, and to support one another. That's what makes you winners, not just today, but in life. The crowd erupted in applause. It was a moment that captured the heart of what the training center stood for. A place where young people could discover their potential, learn the value of resilience, and understand that true victory was about more than just the game. As the event came to a close, Marcos and Carlos stood side by side, looking out at the sea of smiling faces. They had built more than a training program. They had built a community. And in that community, they had left a legacy of hope, strength, and the belief that with the right guidance, the right mindset, and the right support, sports could indeed save lives.